Hello everybody. I've built a number of balsa kits, some with pretty poor documentation from China. Though, by the way, this Hobby King stick and this Blue Angel are both from China, and they're really pretty good flyers, even though the instructions were terrible. I've also built some very good kits from places like SIG and others. But I decided to spring for a higher end kit from Stevens AeroModel. It's called the SHAFT. And I thought I would just go ahead and document the build. My thought was that this video might be helpful to a first-time builder. If you're an experienced builder, this will probably not be of interest to you. So just before we get started, here's a few recommendations. First, these pieces fit together really tightly, so I would recommend you use super thin CA with a tip on the applicator bottle. And even though pins are not needed, you still need a flat building surface, and of course you need to cover the plans. I just happen to like you to use parchment paper for the cover. And finally, read through the entire instructions before you start. They're very good instructions, but it's still easy to get confused if you don't follow the steps carefully, and reading through will help you see what's coming up next in each of the steps. What I'll do with the video is I'll follow the steps in the instruction manual, but I won't repeat all the instructions. I'll just point out some of the things I found out along the way that I thought might be helpful to a new builder. So let's start with the elevator and rudder. One thing you'll notice right away with this kit is the precision of the laser cutting. This is required because the parts are keyed to fit precisely and in only one direction. In this entire build, I only had one piece that was broken from the sheets, and it was really easy to fix with CA. So what I did to get started was I always separate all the pieces, all the parts out for the particular item I'm building. So I did that first with the elevator, and then you carefully slide the parts together. I say carefully because it's really easy to break off one of these keyed areas. They're very small, and if you press too aggressively, you can easily break off the tip. So just, things will fit together very precisely, but you have to take your time and not use too much pressure. Once everything is fits together, you can glue. There's no pinning required. One thing you do need to be careful with on the tail feathers is to cut the pieces of carbon flat bar stock from each of the long pieces, because you're going to need long pieces for the ailerons. What they actually recommend is you cut the aileron pieces first and then use the leftover to cut the stock. You can do that. Just make sure you have enough length for the ailerons. Once everything is glued, you'll have a flat and precisely fitted set of tail feathers. In fact, I was amazed at how flat and square they ended up without any pinning of any parts. Okay, let's move on to the fuselage. There's a lot more parts here, of course, so I only separated what I needed for a few steps at a time. To start, the instructions are very clear about creating the sides. The only really tricky part to start is installing the first former, which you have to twist in place. But just not a big deal. Just take your time and don't force it, and it'll fit in properly. Parts are clearly marked for top and bottom and position, so just follow the pictures so that they fit properly. And don't glue until the instructions tell you to do so. This will help you keep everything square when it is time to glue. For example, in step 5, it's very important to test fit the fuselage sides, just to make sure everything's in the right place and everything is going, all the tabs are in the right direction before you do any gluing. As the instructions point out, I reinforced the firewall with medium CA after bonding with thin CA. So if you're careful with steps 1 through 6, the balsa formers in step 7 will fit nicely and you'll have no problem. It is important in step 10 to properly fit and align the balsa former that holds the blind nuts. This assembly is what ultimately holds the elevator and tail skid, and it's very important that this is installed properly so you end up with a flat and square tail. Steps 11 through 14 are very clear in the instructions. Just make sure you fit everything carefully before you do any gluing. In step 14, you will do your final gluing, making sure everything fits. By that time, everything is so tabbed and keyed that it should be very solid even before you add any final reinforcement gluing that you might need. Building the hatch is straightforward. The instructions are very clear about how to do that. The hatch is not very stiff, but when it's covered, it does fit nicely and is held firmly in place by the magnets. I lightly sanded the edges, but I didn't do a lot of sanding. The fit is so precise, you don't really need to do a ton of sanding. The interlocking parts result in a very square and solid fuselage. I temporarily fit the elevator on the tail just to make sure, and I was able to confirm that it was very square with the fuse. It was just a great fit. No sanding needed. The wing is next. Again, I only remove the parts I need for completing each step as they're listed in the instructions. The long spars need to be assembled from 2 halves, but they're clearly marked and go together quite easily. When all the spars and turbulators are together, you can move on to step 2. For step 2, make sure you position the plywood doubler properly. It is key to building a flat and square wing. At one point, it looks like you're covering an opening, but this actually creates a slot that other pieces fit in later. Make sure the plywood doubler is facing forward as you start to apply the ribs specified in the instructions. The ribs install along the spar in step 4. In step 5, the servo pocket is installed, and in step 6, the center section. All of these parts provide a solid right angle to these sections of the wing. In steps 7 and 8, you install the trailing edge and their wing truss components and the wingtips. All of these parts have notches or slots, so they fit into the pieces very precisely. And as long as you make sure everything is properly seated, the wing will begin to gain strength and stay flat and straight. In step 9, you install the sub ribs, these are the half ribs, into the spar. They're also nicely notched and can be tacked from the back once they're seated. In steps 10 and 11, you build out the front of the wing. As in the rest of the kit, all the parts are notched and fit in only one way. The instructions show all the areas where the turbulator should be flush or protrude. Once you pre-fit them, their proper position is pretty obvious. Installing the leading edge does require a small amount of cutting and fitting, but as long as you hold it tight to the ribs, making it fit properly is quite easy. Steps 12, 13, and 14 are just a matter of fitting pieces that are clearly marked and key into specific points. By this time, the wing is already solid, and these parts should fit in quite easily. Final gluing and sanding are next. You can add any reinforcing glue at this time, though I didn't need to add much. The leading edge does require a bit of sanding, but this is really accomplished in no time at all. I did some light sanding all over before I covered. I have to commend Stevens AeroModel on this wing design. I didn't have to use a single pin during construction, and I still ended up with a very flat and square wing. The rest of the construction steps are clearly outlined in the instructions. I particularly like the aileron design with the flat bar stock. I've had trouble with twisting ailerons on other planes, and these stayed nice and flat. Assembly of the tail skid was also simple and clearly described. The instructions don't mention it, but I used epoxy in this assembly. The instructions mention having to cut the nylon bolts, but the ones provided in my kit were the proper length. Here's my shaft after covering, and I'm just beginning to fit the electronics. I did make one modification. I already had some metal gear servos that were deeper than those specified, so I had to position one a little forward so it would fit. I believe it's the one for the elevator. It was no big deal. If I ever build another shaft, I'll probably put the servos in the alternate position towards the wing. I think it'll be easier to balance and look even cleaner with the servos in that position. Bottom line, I highly recommend the interlocking method used by Stevens AeroModel. The shaft is not a beginner airplane in terms of flying, but it's been a great building experience for a beginning builder, and I would highly recommend it. Thanks for watching.